Hey, what is up, my awesome history students? This is just a little follow-up from our discussion we had through Zoom. Thank you to those that were able to show up, and you were missed if you wanted to go, weren't able to, but that's okay because this is going to be a video to give the information that we talked about. We talked for about an hour, so rather than posting the whole hour discussion of us kind of just talking, this is going to be a more condensed version to be able to bring in some main points that we talked about and to kind of help for moving into the second half of the class. The main thing about this I want to talk about is how to deal with the reading, and we're going to talk about that and then some basic themes that we were talking about with the whole class. So first and foremost, the reading. I know it's a lot of reading. It's a history class. History has a lot of reading. It's one way to learn stuff, but also this is a condensed class, so you have 2 or 3 weeks worth of reading material down into 1 week. So how do you deal with that? And this is something that you'll find throughout your academic career at Shasta or when you transfer to a university. And sometimes, and especially transfer to university, they might say, here, read these like 3 books, and then you're having 3 or 4 different classes that are all assigning 3 or 4 books a week. How do you do that? You have to learn how to properly deal with the reading, how to skim effectively and get the main information, the main gist out of the reading and finding some information, some meat of the reading the best you can without having to spend hours and hours and hours on it. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Now, in my class, especially this world history class, I kind of have it set up in 2 ways. You've already finished the first half of the class. This is week 5, and that means it's actually the last week that we're going to be really focusing on the textbook. So this is a great week, especially there's only 1 chapter this week. So this is a great week for you to really utilize the skills here of skimming and try to really do that with this chapter. And then try to, from here on out, week 6, 7, and 8, they're going to be focused on material that I'm posting in the Canvas page on the modules with their own individual pages. And but you could still do that too. You could still go through the same process of going through and skimming the whole thing first, kind of getting an idea what the pictures are, what some of the themes, what are some of the big words, and having sort of a rough outline of the whole picture before you then kind of fill it in with some information and backtracking a bit. All right, so we're going to do that by looking at a chapter and sort of using this skill builds. And I'm telling you, this is something that I wish I would have really utilized at Shasta, because when I went on to do my undergrad and then grad school, it's something I did end up having to learn, but it would have been so much more useful if I was able to pick it up where you're at here at Shasta. And it's something to take with you the rest of life. All right. So if anything, I know you're not all history majors, but if you could pull this skill out of this class and use it in other classes, then that should be gold. It should be really helpful. Okay. So what I would recommend, if you haven't already do this, and some of you are already doing this, so right on, keep on doing it. But if, before even getting into the reading, if you're like, oh man, I have to read chapters 2 and 3 this week, for example, then before starting to read it, and you have not really much of an idea, go to the module page and go to the assignments for that week. Now, what's useful about Canvas is it tells you what the kind of page it is by this little this little picture here, right? So you know that if it's a page, that's going to be a page. There's no writing assignment attached to it. If it's got something like this, the discussion thing, you know it's going to be something to write on. So you know these are going to be read, and you know that these here are going to be read, and this one here is going to be something to write on. Now, you know that in between the class, now that you've been here a bit, you know my patterns, that there's my brainstorming things where you're able to just put a couple of sentences down to help guide you through the reading and the lectures, that sort of thing. So those are important, but that's not what we're looking at here as far as the reading. What we want to look at is scrolling all the way down, and you'll see the quizzes and stuff, and that's another thing you can pull up. Remember, all my quizzes you could retake. There's no time restraints on them. You could take them. They're designed to help guide reading and information. So you could totally open up the quiz and just go through it once, even just failing it once, so you can go from question to question, see what the main questions are. That helps give an idea, and then you can retake the quiz when you're ready. Or, another thing that's useful and what I'm trying to get to here is the discussions. So you have a Friday discussion, Monday discussion, right? So, by this emblem, there it is. There's the discussion. Pull it up And then you could scroll down. So this was back in week 2 when we were looking at Mesopotamia and looking at Egypt, the 2 river valleys. And just briefly look at the questions. And you could do this in 2 different ways. You could just briefly read it. You could take a picture of it with your phone. You can copy it and put it in a Word document. You can have a little notepad and just write a few notes of what the questions are. So you have an idea of what we're going to be looking at. You don't know what they are. You couldn't answer them now, or maybe you could. But the idea is just to know, okay, what are the questions here? Okay, we're looking about farming. We're looking at life in these agrarian societies. So what's an agrarian society? Maybe that's something to keep an eye on. Looking at, okay, there's a development in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. All right, so maybe there's going to be a comparison between the 2. So as I'm looking at what's happening here, and then I look at the other one, maybe think about what are some of the similarities and differences. Those things, if you're looking at the question, makes those ideas come about before you even get to the reading or the lectures or anything. And then, okay, so travel back in time, which one would I rather be in? Another comparison thing. So, all right, that's kind of helpful. Before I even do the material or the reading, I kind of have an idea of what's going to be to look out for in my quest of the reading. So that's a great thing to do. What I would say now is you have a choice. And people like to do this differently. You know, it's kind of like if you take going into a classroom, sometimes there's some readings that are good to have read before you hear the lecture. And sometimes the lecture helps set it up. So when you do the reading after the lecture, you're more informed and you have an idea of what to look at. So this is up to you. Majority, I would say it's probably easier to do the material in the module first, especially the videos that I do, the lectures. I kind of skim through some of the reading, but maybe watch the videos or listen to them in the car or something, so you have an idea of what the narrative is that we're looking at here. All right, that's useful because then before you get in and open the textbook, you have an idea of what the questions are for the quizzes. You might already looked at the questions for the quiz, and for the discussions, you know what the questions are for the discussions. And if you looked at the videos, you kind of know the overall things, you know some main points. Now you're just going to fill in those gaps with the reading. Now, so let's look up the reading. So here, this should be familiar. This is your book, Voyages, and the PDF version of it. And so now we know, for example, if we're looking at chapter 2, which is about Mesopotamia, what's handy about this textbook, especially in PDF form, is when you scroll down to the contents, you can go to chapter 2 and you can click on the contents right there and it'll take you to it. Now, let me stop here for a second. In any book that you're looking at, whether it's a textbook or if you're assigned a book and you need to spend about an hour on it or 2, first place to go always is the contents page, because you'll have an idea of how it's laid out. It's very, very useful. So even with this one, you know we're looking at chapter 2. Well, you could kind of read, here's chapter 2, complex societies. Okay, that's going to be an important thing to know. Eastern Mediterranean. And you could kind of see what the topics are going to be about right here. So if you read this, that's going to help sort of give you an idea of the direction. This is something that builds on if you're in the class and you're in different subjects and you take it to the next level, because you'll kind of have a familiarity with these topics if it's something you're going to explore further in life. So as you get going, you're like, oh, this is about Eastern Mediterranean. Oh, cool. Look at that. We're also going to look at Egypt in the same chapter. Remember in the question, there was something about comparing the 2. Now I have an idea that's going to be happening in this part and that part. See, so already you're getting an idea of what to be looking for, rather than saying, oh my gosh, I have a chapter to read, 30 pages, what am I going to do? So it alleviates a lot of anxiety. You can't learn anything if you got anxiety. All right, so see how I did that? I just clicked on the chapter 2, and it's going to pop up right there. There's chapter 2. All right, so here's the chapter. What a lot of people do, and what I really recommend moving away from, is you have, especially if you have a physical book, you're going to have like 3 or 4 different color highlighters. You're going to have a pen. You're going to have maybe a couple of post-it notes. And as you read, you're going to start with page 1 of the chapter. You're going to start reading and highlighting things you think are important. You're going to write notes. You're going to jot it down on the side. And it's going to take you hours to get through the chapter. And you're going to get lost in that process because it's so much information thrown at you, you just get bogged down, you get overwhelmed, and then you're going to get burnt out. And you might do that for a chapter, but then next week or the other chapter you have to read, you're not going to get any of it done. Does that sound familiar? Because that's where I was at when I started as a student, when I was first looking at history classes. But what I found is this little skill of how to brush through the reading a little easier, get the gist out of it, get the main information out, and give yourself a lot less time to read it, but be able to hone your skills of pulling out, drawing out the information. Well, then A, it won't burn you out, so you can do this week after week. B, you won't be so overwhelmed if you're assigned a bunch of reading because you'll know how to handle it. And you can adjust how much time you have to give using these skills. And then, and 3, you're going to get more out of it because you won't be so bogged down with so much information of the red highlighter, the blue highlighter, these notes and those notes. That's just going to freak you out. All right. So what I would say is there's really like 3 parts to this. All right. The first part, now you've already looked at the questions for the quizzes maybe, and for the discussions. You've looked at the material. You might have looked at the lectures already. So it should be a little bit of a familiarity of what you're going to be looking at here. Then, so you get to the chapter. The textbooks are great because they're going to try to lay things out for you with some information like this here of what's happening. Here's the sections. Here's a bit of a timeline. It's useful. This textbook I chose, and I like using it because it always starts with a travel narrative, right? So the idea is someone of that time period is traveling to this area that we're going to be looking at, and they're an outsider to it. It's new to them. They're looking at it with their view from an outside perspective of what they're seeing in this society. In a lot of ways, that's what we are too. We're traveling from, the future, trying to look at the past. We're trying to look at this in the back then, but we're also looking at it with outside eyes. So it's really cool to get that gist of a travel narrative or some story of who these people are through a little bit of a story. And that always is set up with that introductory part. That's a pretty good thing to read, but that's not what we're going to do for this first thing. What we're first going to do is give maybe 10 minutes max. All right. You can even set a timer. Give yourself like 10 minutes to skim the whole chapter. All right. And the reason I say maybe give yourself 10 minutes is because of maybe some old habits, you're going to stop for places, you're going to spend time to read a long time. And next thing you know, it's hour, maybe 2 hours, and you're no further ahead. So this is why maybe 10 minutes max, and look for a few things. You're going to go through page after page, and you're going to do this pretty fast to get a general gist of what this is about. All right. And you're going to ask yourself, what is this? What do I think this is going to be about? What do I think some of the main ideas are here? What are some of the main concepts? And you can see that. Give yourself credit because you'll find that a lot easier and quicker as you go. So, you can kind of say, okay, there's emergence of complex societies in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the old, the middle, international system. Okay, and then there's this new empire developing here. All right, not sure what that is, but those are things that are going to be in this chapter. Then, every chapter has a travel narrative. Here's the travel narrative. Okay, there's this dude called Enkidu. All right. Oh, look, there's a nice map. Maps are good because they tell you what area we're looking at here. My guess, here's the travel. So the traveler of Gilgamesh, whoever that is traveling around this land here. This must be what we're going to be studying. All right, cool. Well, that's the Nile. There's the Middle East, but that's what they're calling the Eastern Mediterranean. That must be Mesopotamia. Oh, look, cool. Right, so there you go. Moving on. Bit of a timeline. Travel narrative looks like it's done. Here's some good focus questions. What's the focus on? You could read those. It's always useful. Traveling through. There's complex societies. That kept coming up in the questions. Okay, what's that? A complex society is a large urban center with a population and, nice. Okay, that's useful. Moving along. And as you're doing this, see, I'm not spending much time. I'm reading maybe some of the side notes here. I'm looking at the bold words, and I'm moving through. And the idea is you're creating in your mind a rough outline of a narrative of the whole chapter. Think of it like a sculptor. When a sculptor starts off, they don't just start with, making a finished product of a hand and the face. They might start with a rough outline of the rock to give the whole thing shape. And that's what you're doing by doing this process. You're getting the rough outline of the whole narrative that you need to read. So you're traveling through, oh, look at that. Well, we're at first beer. Well, that's pretty cool. Okay. And then, oh, look, there's pictures there. What's the picture showing? What's it telling? What's this thing showing? You cool. All right. Oh, that must be the first part. This must now move into Egypt. Remember the comparisons? When I read that first part, I'll think about how I'm going to compare it to the second part. All right. Moving through, there's the Nile, there's the pictures, right? Going through, information. And you're going to do this for the whole chapter. And you're going to look at each of the words, kind of get through it. All that stuff. Okay, interesting. There's good moments. Oh, there's that flood system. There's Gilgamesh. Oh, that's going to be interesting. We could read that. Going through, And then at the end, and this is why it's useful with textbooks, there's always a chapter review, right? So this is a great thing to see. Oh, there's all those key terms there. Here's some main information in paragraph form. You might want to read that because it gives you a just overview of each of the sections here. And there you go. And you'll have that whole thing done. Now, that could take 10 minutes, 15 minutes max. You'll kind of have a full idea from start to finish, a rough outline of what is going on. Now, before you kind of go back to it, give yourself a couple minutes to sort of think, okay, what did I get out of that? What is sort of the main gist of this chapter now? What are some of the things I saw that are interesting here, that are important? If I've already listened to the lecture, what are some things I saw here that connects to the lecture, some of the stuff I already have looked at in this before I got into the reading? See, now you have a little bit more of an overview of what's going on. It won't be so daunting. You're not going to go back and highlight every little thing because you already kind of know as you go back to read where the important parts are going to lie. Okay? So now, this took about 10 minutes. Now you're going to go back. And what I would recommend, and no matter what you're reading, is read the introduction, because that's going to give you an idea. The author, if it's a good author, is going to say what the main arguments are. What's this all about? What's the main information? It's like the beginning of a lecture when they give some sort of outline of what the whole class is going to be about. It's the same thing with a chapter. Same thing with a book. If you have to do this with a book, reading that introductory chapter will give you a whole outline and a direction of what the whole book's going to be like. So the same with a chapter in a textbook. That introduction, especially with the travel narrative, is going to take you a journey through that travel narrative and explain what the whole chapter is about. So give yourself some time to read that. Don't try to highlight everything. Just read it. Just like you're having a conversation with somebody. Just read that. Then as you go, and let's say you're really limited on time, and you're like, oh man, I just don't have all the time in the world. You kind of know a pattern about reading, and this needs to develop more and more. The more you do it, the easier it will get. So A, going back to reading the introduction to get a big idea of what's going on. And then B is at least start reading the topic sentences of chapters, of paragraphs. Topic sentences of paragraphs guide what's that whole chapter, or that whole paragraph is all about. So if you go through and read the topic sentences, you already kind of know what you're going to be looking for here, right? Because you have an idea of what the questions are, you have an idea of the gist, you know you're going to be comparing, so you're going to be looking for things. If you read the topic sentences, and this is something, again, it's going to be hard when you first do it, but as you do that, you're going to read those topic sentences and skim the middle. That's going to be evidence, right? So every paragraph, if you've taken an English class, you know there's a topic sentence, there's the body of the paragraph, and there's a conclusion sentence, right? That's what it's like no matter what you read. So if you read the topic sentence, you know what that paragraph's going to be about. If you know, wow, this paragraph is incredibly important, I know this question came up about it, well, guess what? In the middle of that paragraph is going to be some evidence for you. And it might go into the next paragraph and the next paragraph, but you know, okay, well, this information is really useful. And you can spend a little more time in that little bit. And you move along, read those topic sentences. Oh, this is really interesting. I'll go a little further. Boom. That at first is difficult. That at first is going to take you some time. But the more you do it, just like any skill, it's going to become easier and easier. And you'll be able to rock a chapter using this process. And if you have to do it on a book, so if you see behind me, you can do that with a book. You start to do that, and you can get through a book with the main information in like an hour. The whole book, can you imagine? And it's true. Just using this sort of process. So that's going to be a useful thing. Now, spend, as you kind of go, if you have more time, read the chapter and get some main information out the best you can. But if you're really limited in time, doing this process of skimming effectively, looking at the whole thing first, so you can have a bit of a picture of what's the start and finish looks like, going back and filling in the gaps with information is going to be so much more effective than starting at the beginning, highlighting everything as you go, and just being overwhelmed with information. By the time you get halfway into the end of the chapter, it's you're no further along because you're just inundated with information thrown at you. You're overwhelmed, anxiety's high, you're tired, you're fatigued, and you're like absolutely burnt out with the class. All right, so this takes that all away. 10 minutes at first to do it, and then maybe max give yourself an hour to go through that chapter, trying to pull information out the best you can, reading that introduction, reading the topic sentences. When you find something that's really good, finding some of the examples in that paragraph or that page, reading the side notes in this chapter, reading those bold words, but not trying to write everything down. Getting that information. If anything you're going to write down, look at the questions of the discussions and write notes for how you would use and answer those questions based on what you're reading. That's going to help it sink in a lot easier. That's going to help it so you don't have 20 pages of notes of all this information, and then you have to figure out how to put that into the discussion form. That's a whole lot of other extra steps that is just not necessary if you do this process. All right, so this is week number 5. We're looking at ancient Persia and the development of the Greek Empire. So it's one chapter, chapter 5. So please try this with that chapter if you haven't already started that. Look at the whole chapter first of what's going on and how it's going to be a comparison with Persia and Greece. So look at some of the stuff that's going to show the comparisons. Look at what are some of the developments they're going to see with certain words and processes that you sort of see through those pages. And then go back and start to fill in the gaps. All right. I'm going to post below this video. I'm going to try to post it. I have a PDF that's very useful of using this process of understanding the readings through what's called 3 close reads. It's used with the World History Project. It's very useful, and it helps sort of jot down notes in a useful way by the stuff that we're talking about, by getting the gist first, what you think this chapter's about, and then kind of going back and filling in some of the important points as you do that process of closely reading after that. All right. So I know this might be completely different than how you ever read before, completely different than maybe what you're told by teachers. But I hope it's a pragmatic approach of how to deal with a large body of reading, not get overwhelmed, not get bogged down with information, and to get it so it's most useful bits out of the reading to actually be applied to assignments. All right. So that's the first part of that done. Now, in the next just a couple minutes, one thing we talked about in our Zoom little interaction was, people like the video I recently did, if you haven't seen it, of an overview of the whole class. In very short sort of cliff note form, I went back from what week 1 was, week 2, week 3, week 4, and then what the second half of the class was going to look like. And some of the people mentioned in the discussion that that was useful because it helped paint a picture. And if you can kind of think of the world picture of the world, you can start to place geographically parts of each week of where they're placed, how they interact, and that sort of thing. Cool. Another thing that we were talking about that's useful, though, is some of the big themes of this class and how they are used and interact. For example, I've mentioned many times world systems of exchange. Remember the transfer of goods, ideas, people, disease. Now, that plays out week after week in different ways. In fact, if we were to do a whole history class of world history, that would play from the beginning of time right up to present day. In fact, most recently, if you look at situation of COVID in the world, we could put that in the same form. That is part of the process of world systems of exchange, because disease that started in one part of the world through interaction of people brought the disease and started to make global changes of the disease. That crippled economics, that created social pressures, individual anxieties, all this stuff at a global scale. That happens throughout history, and you can kind of apply that experience that we've gone through recently with experiences that you read about in the past. So, just to kind of go into it later towards the end of our class, we're going to look at what's known as the Plague of Justinian, and it was a very similar plague that killed millions of people worldwide in the Afro-Eurasia region. And it happened again in 1346 and 48, and that was a process of exchange, of people interacting. Now, it's a good way to see it with disease because you can see the devastation, but that happens with goods too. Another big theme we've looked at throughout this class is religion. Religion, some people email me and say, wow, I didn't realize I was taking a world religions class. Well, you can't separate ancient history with religion. They go so close hand in hand. And we saw that with the Ashoka. We saw that with the Buddhism and Confucianism. This week, we're seeing that with Zoroastrianism and the Persian Empire. There's this important thing that people who are trading goods and exchanging things, they're also exchanging ideas of religion. There's missionaries where their purpose is to exchange the religion. And how political formations occur by harnessing political and religious ideologies for control. That is throughout history, right? So it's important to see how politics and culture is developed through the lens of a specific religious belief and ideologies. And that's what we do week after week as well. So if you kind of know that, you're like, okay, how does religion play a role in Persia? How does the polytheistic religions in the Greek world sort of interact and work in their interactions and culture? Then you can compare that later with Rome. Then Christianity is going to come about and how that changes after that. So religion is one of those threads that's a very useful tool in this, along with exchange, world system of exchange. Okay, and there's lots of other ones, but if you can kind of, even for you, take a step back and think, all right, what are some themes that I see from the beginning, from looking at Paleolithic society and looking at, the Venus figurines, looking at certain cultural interactions, looking at when people settled down and created new careers, new complex society. What makes a complex society? And do we see that week after week? And how does that change or remain the same? If you kind of have an idea of those things, it makes it even easier when you're getting more information because you already have a pattern to build upon, right? It's not so foreign because you've seen it play out time and time again in this class. All right. So remember, it's new information each week, but in a way, it's building off things you're already learning, processes and ideas and the way things are working, that you can connect it to that. That's why there's so many questions in the discussions about comparisons, because it helps reinforce what you've learned. It helps show how things change, but also how things remain the same, right? History is cool that way. It allows you to really see that time and time again throughout history. So it's something to think about. One thing we talked about in the class with the world system of exchange of good, people, ideas, and disease, what happens with Christopher Columbus, if you think of the whole world, in a way, before Columbus, there were two worlds. There was the Afro-Eurasia world on one side. So you have, Asia, the Middle East, you have what becomes Europe and Africa. That's all interacting, and actually even into the Pacific region and into Australia, if you can look at that, that's all interacting through systems of exchange. What that separates from the other world of North America and Central and South America and their own system of exchange, of interaction. Yes, between those two worlds, there's individuals that do make it across. Like there's some Vikings, there's different peoples that travel, and then they normally stay in that region, though. So if they cross the Bering Strait, or if they went north, or if they went across regions, they've stayed in those two separate worlds. What Christopher Columbus does is he doesn't discover a new world. He doesn't even create a new world. And the fact that he doesn't look at he doesn't find a new world anyway. What he does do is, in a way, his and the others that follow him, they do in fact create a new world, and that there's, rather than two worlds, there's one, because the system of exchange goes across the Atlantic in large scale. And we see that. This is, in the U.S. history class, at the beginning of U.S. history class, or world history too, really picks up on this, because you already know how the devastation of disease wipes out people in the Americas, right? How did that happen? Well, the Afro-Eurasia world built antibodies to fight things, right? The things that were killing off people, it was able to have resistance for thousands of years. There wasn't any resistance because it was like a whole nother world. So if you can kind of think of Columbus in that way, that this world system of exchange we're talking about that's happening globally in two different worlds after 1492 into the 1500s, 1600s, and on even to today, that all interacts together. And it changes, where people are now interacting at a global scale, where goods are interacting at a global scale. And we call that the Columbian Exchange. You don't need to know that, but just to give yourself an idea, you like pizza? If you like pizza, you would not have had pizza developed in Italy if it wasn't for the exchange of the worlds, with people coming to the Americas and finding the tomato. There weren't any tomatoes in all of Afro-Eurasia world until after the Christopher Columbus and the Columbian Exchange, what happens afterwards. So same with the potato. A lot of people link potato with Ireland or something. There weren't any potatoes in that part of in the Western, in the Europe or Africa, or there was different types of things like the potato, but the potato comes from the Americas. So the exchange of goods, people, disease happens in the Afro-Eurasia world. It happens in the Americas. Then later, when those worlds intersect, it becomes a global world. Okay, so we're talking about at a smaller scale. We're talking about what is happening about in Afro-Eurasia world. We're talking about what is happening in the Americas. Now, with this week, we're going to talk about what's happening with the Mediterranean, that exchange in that Mediterranean world, right? Picture on the map the Mediterranean, and how Persia is coming to the eastern side of that. Then what the Greeks do is they have control over that part of Persia, what the old Persian Empire, that part of the Mediterranean. Next week, or the week after, when we're looking at the Romans, they're controlling the Mediterranean world, right? And then after that, how that expands to the fall of Rome and what happens after that. At the same time, what China's doing on the other side of the Afro-Eurasia world. Okay, so there's a lot in there, but the main thing I was just saying is, when you think of the main processes and things happening in this class, remember how much they repeat themselves, and it'll help you week after week. And if you go into that second world history class where we're looking at the 1400s after, you already have an idea of how that's played out, because what happens with Columbus, what happens with everybody else, exchanging goods and ideas and peoples, and this brings war, this brings control of areas, this brings all that stuff. You already have that. You know it, because it's all part of the processes of day one in world history, and week after week build on the same themes. And that's what we're doing with this class. All right, so just something to think about as for the longevity of this class, of how these processes work, how patterns, we've already heard history repeats itself. In a way it does week after week, with patterns that are emerging, that are staying the same, of how areas and cultures are developed. All that plays a major role, and you got it. All right, so that's just what we talked about in the Zoom class. If there's any comments, love to hear it below. If you want me to expand on anything, if you want to talk, if you want to do a one-on-one chat or a small group, we can always schedule that. I always love having chats with y'all. All right, have a great day. Have a great rest of the week, and talk to you soon.